So as I was saying, the Green Sanctuary team here at the Fellowship is doing wonderful work, and I want to support that. I don't want to speak about the particulars of the program that's well publicized in the newsletter and so on. So, but I do encourage you to learn and find out and get engaged with the Green Sanctuary process and program here at the Fellowship. I wanted to speak more about some of the spiritual resources that might be available to people as they do this work of environmental ministry. So when Unitarian Universalists want to be informed and encouraged and instructed in our environmental activism, of course we look first to the insights and perspectives offered by the modern sciences of ecology. When it comes to religious support and inspiration, we tend to turn to earth-centered traditions such as Native American wisdom, braiding sweetgrass, for example, or neo-pagan practices, or perhaps we draw upon the teachings of Eastern nature-oriented religions like Taoism, or Buddhist ideas of radical interdependence. But we tend not to draw upon Christian texts and traditions in the same way. In fact, there sometimes seems to be a kind of built-in hostility toward Christianity among environmentally concerned people, a sense that Christianity is a big part of the problem, not a possible part of the solution. I wonder where that animosity comes from. I remember once in a church far, far away, I put in a newsletter as an upcoming sermon title, Green Christianity. And the next day, I received a phone call from someone, not someone I'd ever seen on a Sunday morning, someone who just happened to be on the church's mailing list. I picked up the phone and she just lit into me. There's no such thing as green Christianity. How could you think that? Christianity is the source of all the problems and the environment. She went on and on. And finally, when she paused to take a breath, I said, "You're welcome to come on Sunday to hear what I actually have to say." All this from the two-word title. It just unleashed this torrent of anger. And I wonder, of course, she hung up at that point. I never heard from her or saw her again, but she had her say, and I wondered, where does this anger come from? Both hers and mine, for that matter. I think the best place to begin answering this question is in 1966 with an address given to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences by the historian Lynn White. The title of his talk was The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis. It's important to think back and remember that this was at the very beginning of the modern environmental movement. It was still 4 years before the first Earth Day, just 4 years after the publication of Rachel Carson's prophetic book, Silent Spring, which really brought environmental problems to mass public awareness for the first time in this country. Human consciousness was being raised, as they said back in the 60s, and White was a part of that wider cultural movement. In 1967, his address was published in the prestigious journal Science, and from there it was widely reprinted, read, and criticized by many, beginning a conversation that continues to this day, and a conversation that still matters to this day. A dialogue about the relationship between religious belief and practice on the one hand, and environmental sustainability or degradation on the other. Now, Lynn White's academic specialty was the history of technology, and he was especially interested in the way that science and technology had developed in the West, that is in Western Europe, beginning in the late Middle Ages and accelerating through the Renaissance and the early modern age. Nowadays, scientific research and technological innovation are global realities. Science is the same whether it's practiced in the United States or China or Nigeria or Venezuela. But historically, the unique synthesis of theoretical investigation and practical technological application that we call science had its origins within Western Europe. And came about as the result of the unique combination of intellectual and cultural factors found there, which means, and this is important to White, that science developed within the context and worldview of Christendom. Its deep assumptions were shaped and formed by Christian dogmatic assumptions. So the growth of science and technology, argued White, cannot be understood historically apart from the distinctive attitudes toward nature, which are deeply grounded in Christian dogma. And here's where the problem lies, according to White. The first problem is that Christianity is a deeply anthropocentric tradition. Especially in its Western form, he writes, Christianity is the most anthropocentric religion the world has seen. According to the account in Genesis, writes White, and I'm quoting him here, God planned all of creation for man's benefit and rule. No item in the physical creation had any purpose save to serve man's purposes. The commandment in the first chapter of Genesis to, quote, have dominion over the birds of the air and over the cattle and over all the earth and over every creeping thing that lives upon the earth is taken as carte blanche license to exploit and manipulate nature for our benefit. Nature exists solely as a kind of backdrop or scenery against which the important human historical drama of salvation is played out. Again, it is White's view that this basic anthropocentric attitude persists even among people who consider themselves post-Christian, because it determines at such a deep level our fundamental perception of the world and of our place and posture within it. So the second problem, according to White, is that Christianity is a dualistic tradition, one that separates spirit and matter, separates God and the world, divides humanity from nature, and so forth. Though Adam is made of clay, White claims he shares in God's transcendence of the earth. Remember that great movie, The African Queen, where Katharine Hepburn's character, Rose Sayers, says to Humphrey Bogart's riverboat captain, Mr. Allnut, Katharine Hepburn says, nature, Mr. Allnut, is what we were put in this world to rise above. That's that perspective of separateness and of superiority, well captured in that line from the movie. Here again, the origin of this primal split is located in the story found in Genesis. It is fundamentally due to this story, writes the Japanese Zen Buddhist scholar D.T. Suzuki, that Western people talk so much about conquering nature. When they invent a flying machine, they say they have conquered the air. When they climb to the top of Mount Everest, they make the loud announcements they have succeeded in conquering the mountain. By setting humans apart from and above nature in this dualistic fashion, Christianity, according to White, encourages a hierarchical view that encourages domination and control. So together, these basic attitudes result in a world that has been drained of its sacred significance. Max Weber, the great German sociologist, called this the process of Entzauberung, or disenchantment. It means really taking the magic away, Entzauberung. And this is the process of modernity, depends upon this disenchantment. Pagan religion in antiquity, according to White, was animistic. Every stream, every tree, every mountain contained a guardian spirit who had to be carefully propitiated before one put a mill in a stream or cut a tree or mined the mountain. By destroying pagan animism, Christianity made it possible to exploit nature in a mood of indifference to the feelings of natural objects. And the victory of Christianity over paganism, White concludes, was the greatest psychic revolution in the history of our culture. There's a famous story, which White does not refer to, but a story about the 8th century Christian missionary who later came to be known as Saint Boniface, cutting down a magnificent oak tree in a sacred grove that was dedicated to the Germanic pagan god Thor. I think of that beautiful story about the kapok tree last Sunday. But you can imagine this tree, sacred tree in a sacred grove. So he cut it down, he chopped it down, and he challenged Thor to strike him dead on the spot. And when that did not happen, as a consequence of this blasphemous act, supposedly the German tribesmen converted en masse to Christianity on the spot. Well, that story was embellished and elaborated, of course, but whatever may have happened historically, the story still stands as a powerful and painful symbol of the confrontation between two worldviews. One which saw nature as enchanted and sacred, and one which saw it as, at best, the neutral raw material from which to carve out a merely human destiny. White concludes that Christianity bears a huge burden of guilt for the environmental crisis. And since the problem had religious roots, he argued, there had to be a religious dimension to its resolution, which is to say, environmental problems are inherently religious in nature. More science and more technology are not going to get out of the present ecological crisis, he says, until we find a new religion or rethink our old one. And here's the kicker, though. Unlike many critics of Christianity's complicity in environmental degradation, White was himself a believing, practicing Christian, a committed Presbyterian elder. He was criticizing his own tradition from within, and he believed that it could be redeemed. In the 60s, they used to say, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. And White wanted Christianity to be part of the solution. Now, he didn't have a lot to say in terms of positive recommendations, but in the concluding sentence of his what was to become an enormously influential essay, White tantalizingly proposed the 13th century saint Francis of Assisi as the, quote, patron saint for ecologists. White called Francis the greatest radical in Christian history since Jesus. So what was so special about Francis? Well, in a nutshell, you might say that he extended the virtue of humility, always recognized as a virtue. Francis extended it beyond the individual to encompass the human species as a whole. We as human beings need as a species to exercise humility with respect to the rest of creation. This was Francis's revolution. According to White, Francis tried to depose man from his monarchy over creation and set up a democracy of all God's creatures. The hymn we sang just earlier is based on Francis's famous Canticle to the Sun, and it expresses that notion that all creatures have a voice with which to praise or to lament. That idea is not original to Francis, of course. The ancient Hebrew Psalms are full of this sentiment, which is hardly what I would call anthropocentric. One of his earliest biographers wrote of Francis, when he found an abundance of flowers, he preached to them and invited them to praise the Lord as though they were endowed with reason. In the same way, he exhorted with sincerest purity grain fields and vineyards, stones and forests, and all the beautiful things of the fields, fountains of water and the green things of the gardens, earth and fire, air and wind, to love God and serve him willingly. In other words, Francis of Assisi was what we could call a Christian animist. He saw the creation alive in its creatures, every one of them. And in 1979, Pope Paul did just what White had proposed and declared, John Paul II, did just what White had proposed and declared Francis the patron saint of ecologists. And of course, the current Pope has taken the name Francis and published his wonderful encyclical Laudato Si, addressing the climate crisis. So perhaps there was something to White's suggestion. At any rate, in this address, he threw down the gauntlet regarding the relationship between the ecological crisis and Christianity in particular. And in the years following the publication of his essay, there was a great deal of vigorous debate about his thesis. And I just want to point to a couple of what I think of as serious problems with his argument. For one, it wasn't until the 16th and 17th centuries and the rise of the scientific revolution that this new vision of reality arose in Western Europe that led to a view of nature and the role of human beings in the creation that persists to this day and underlies most of how we still think about the relationship between ourselves and nature. The scientific worldview, pioneered by such men as Francis Bacon, René Descartes, Isaac Newton, and others, represented a sharp departure from biblical and Christian thought, although White insists science could only ever have arisen within the Christianized, secularized, disenchanted world of Western Europe. And here's where the Bateson parable may be relevant. The human capacity to reason purposively is a great gift and a powerful tool, but to use it in a way that ignores the wider systemic connections within which we are embedded, the interdependent web of all existence. To exercise this purposive reason, this narrowly focused exercise of intelligence, is unwise, to put it mildly. Lack of systemic wisdom, says Bateson, is always punished. So Adams says, it's a vengeful God. I should never have eaten that apple. But the problem is systemic, says Bateson, and the solution must surely depend on realizing this fact. First, there is humility, and Bateson says, I propose this not as a moral principle, but simply as an item of scientific philosophy. In the period of, and Bateson here is speaking as a scientist, a very respected and renowned scientist. In the period of the Industrial Revolution, he says, perhaps the most important disaster was the enormous increase of scientific arrogance. We had discovered how to make trains and other machines. We knew how to put one box on top of the other to get that apple. And Occidental man saw himself as an autocrat with complete power over a universe which was made of physics and chemistry. So, sorry, I have it on both sides here. So evolution, says in this view, according to Bateson, was the history of how organisms learned more tricks for controlling the environment, and man had better tricks than any other creature. But that arrogant scientific philosophy is now obsolete, he says. And in its place there's the discovery that man is only a part of larger systems and that the part can never control the whole. I certainly agree with that. But I strongly disagree with White's assertion that Christian doctrine claims that nature has no reason for existence save to serve man. That simply is not the case, as any consulting of the text would have told him. The magnificent speech from the whirlwind that brings the book of Job to its climax makes it very clear that other creatures have their purposes and reason for being, which have nothing to do with human beings. Actually, in the Bible, the natural world is seen as very much alive or animate. In numerous passages, the earth and its flora and fauna are depicted as vibrant, sensitive, and responsive to the good and evil wrought by God and man. The very stones cry out in protest of injustice. The trees shout and clap their hands and so forth. The natural world enters into moral and even legal and covenantal relationships with human beings and with the divine. In other words, nature is very far from being disenchanted in or by the Bible. That disenchantment didn't really come about until the modern scientific revolution. One of the most interesting and helpful of White's early critics was the distinguished French-American biologist René Dubos. He proposed as an alternative to Francis, the 6th century monk who came to be known as Saint Benedict, the founder of the Benedictine monastic movement. The environmental impact of this movement in Europe cannot be overestimated, according to Dubos. The Benedictine monks pioneered and practiced what we today would call sustainable agriculture on a large scale. They transformed the landscape of Europe, reclaiming malaria-ridden swamplands and turning them into productive farmland fit for human habitation. So the Benedictine vision contrasts with the Franciscan approach, which revered nature in its wild, uncultivated state. Francis would agree with Henry David Thoreau that in wildness is the preservation of the world. And Benedict had a more interventionist view of the proper role for humans, one which saw us as stewards of nature, actively tending and keeping, that's the actual biblical phrase, tending and keeping what has been given. So Benedict's ideal was a pastoral landscape rather than a raw wilderness. Now, these are not either or binary choices, but creative tensions. We can and need to hold both in tension, I believe. The contemporary environmental movement has a preservationist wing and a stewardship wing, as we might call them. And both of them, I think, are important and necessary. Unfortunately, the shadow of the preservation wing is what I sometimes call environmental Calvinism. The view expressed by some that the planet would be better off without human beings. And I know I have friends and environmentalist friends who say basically this thing, who hold to this view, the planet would be better off without us. I call that environmental Calvinist. It's the secular equivalent of the doctrine of total depravity, which the Calvinists championed and which the Unitarians set themselves against. So I don't know why a religious movement that rejected Calvinism in its theological form would adopt a secular version of it with regard to environmental ethics. So the wilderness view has its shadow, if you will. The stewardship perspective, for its part, hasn't really been very effective in preventing environmental degradation. Like the just war theory, which is supposed to limit the use of military force, but it hasn't really done that very well over the centuries. The stewardship perspective has not been particularly effective in confronting economic powers that are bent on exploitation of natural resources. So whether one adopts a stewardship model or a conservationist model, the point is that the Christian tradition doesn't have a singular environmental ethic, but contains within itself several strands of thought and practice relating to nature. Borrowing a metaphor from evolutionary biology, White observes that in every complex religious tradition there are recessive genes, which in new circumstances may become dominant genes. St. Francis is one example, and goes on to note that scattered throughout the Bible, there are passages that can be read as sustaining the notion of a spiritual democracy of all creatures. The point is, White adds, is that historically they seem seldom or never to have been so interpreted. This should not inhibit anyone from taking a fresh look at them. And that's exactly what's happening. And what I'm trying to indicate in this sermon is many Christians and non-Christians are re-examining this tradition to recover the recessive strands within it that support a wise and sustainable environmental ethic. Sometimes I get the feeling that certain secular environmentalist critics of Christianity never read past the one problematic verse that they just know is the root of all evil, the one having to do with dominion. And that's there, and that verse has to be dealt with, but it's just one verse. In the 1960s, when he was still governor of California, Ronald Reagan reportedly said, "If you've seen one redwood, you've seen them all," forever showing his insensitivity to the natural world. Sometimes I think that secularist critics of biblical environmental traditions say, in effect, if you read that one verse, you've read it all, not recognizing the depth and complexity and richness of the tradition and the importance of context. So again, we deprive ourselves of potential resources that can ground us as we go about the work of fighting for the earth. In his fascinating book, Memories and Visions of Paradise, Uncovering the Universal Myth of a Lost Golden Age, Richard Heinberg reviews the evidence and concludes that the memory of paradise represents an innate and universal human longing for a state of being that is natural and utterly fulfilling, but from which we have somehow excluded ourselves. Whether it was a historical reality or not, paradise exists in the eternal present as an image expressing our deepest sense of what is true or right about ourselves. Paradise can be a regressive kind of nostalgia for a world that never was, or it can be a progressive invitation to inhabit this world, this present world, in a way that is wiser and more delightful as we discover the gifts that surround us and include us. Diane and I made a quick trip to Paradise yesterday. We drove up to Galesville to pay respects at the gravesite of the Reverend David O. Van Slyke. And I'd been there before, actually long before I knew I was going to be a minister here. I'd visited. But it was special with Diane on a very beautiful day. And we went to the top of the cemetery hill and found his stone obelisk, well taken care of, a nice, a little American flag there stuck in the holder to recognize his service in the Grand Army of the Republic in the Civil War. And there was a feeling of peacefulness. And when he came back, again, I returned to that story that he, in the course of his wanderings and his wild speculations and his literalist interpretation of the Bible, all of that aside, he managed in that process to recollect himself, to heal himself, and to find himself again at home in the place where he was meant to be. People still thought he was a fool. People still said he was crazy, and perhaps he was. But there are better ways to be a fool than to think that where you live, to be convinced that where you are is the very center of the world, the very paradise, the Garden of Eden. Perhaps he was right. Maybe we really do live in paradise. I cannot follow his literalistic mapping of the biblical text onto the landscape, of course, but I'm inspired by the creative and imaginative way that he made space for his own inner healing to take place. And he found his healing as he found his place in the world. And that's our challenge as well. The first question that God asked of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, the very first question asked of humanity is, where are you? Where are you? Not in the sense of your geographical coordinates, like you could use a GPS satellite to locate yourself. Not where are you in that sense, but where are you existentially? Where are you in your world? Are you at home? Are you in exile? Are you lost? A question, where are we? Is the first question. It's then that we can begin to do what a work is ours. I'm reminded of the poem by David Wagner, and I'll close with this. It's a poem called Lost. Stand still, he says. The trees ahead and the bushes beside you are not lost. Wherever you are is called here. And you must treat it as a powerful stranger, must ask permission to know it and be known. The forest breathes. Listen. It answers. I have made this place around you. If you leave it, you may come back again saying, here. No two trees are the same to raven. No two branches are the same to wren. If what a tree or a bush does is lost on you, you are surely lost. Stand still. The forest knows where you are. You must let it find you. So we live in this place. As we learn to know it, it comes to know us. And in that process, a kind of mutual healing can begin. But it begins with that being committed to this place, being here in this place now, this sacred space, sacred place. So just try as an experiment, try to see the world through Reverend Van Slyke's eyes. Take a walk on the bluffs, with or without a book in your hands, and learn to look and see this present paradise as a place to love and to tend and to serve. Amen.